Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Lee. I'm founder of the Hollywood Sound Museum, and I am the producer, thanks to my friend here. I am the producer of the Wilhelm Scream documentary, which Anna Quinlan here is the director of and brought me in to help make this. And we're going to give you a little update and talk about sound. How are you, Anna?
I am doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm fine, working away.
Yeah,
Good stuff, sound stuff.
keeping it rolling. We just saw each other virtually
Virtually, we did our
very
last batch of
recently.
interviews. Yeah.
That's right. We worked with Vicky Sampson to shoot an interview with Richard L. Anderson, as he's known formally. And we had a blast. It was kind of a tricky production experience, but
Yeah, it
it
had
worked out.
difficulties, but it was okay. I mean, it
Yeah.
was important because that's Richard is a very important piece of the puzzle, and a lot of people
Yes.
don't know that. Even if you are familiar with the history of the Scream, Richard Anderson has some vital plot points that you might not know.
Absolutely, which has been one of my favorite parts of this process is I think the first name, even if among people who know what the Wilhelm Scream is, I think the first name that springs to mind is Ben Burt, who
Of
sound
course,
designed Star Wars and so many other great films. But I think in a lot of ways, Richard is kind of been behind the how prolifically used it is, and part of the reason I got excited to talk to him in the first place was when I did my very cursory version of research. His name came up just like 3 to 4 times as many times as other sound supervisors, and I was like, oh well,
yeah,
there's something here. This person who I hadn't found him beforehand, but I was like, wow, this person really, he's a champion
yeah.
of it, and he's just the very, very open, kind, very excited about sound. He has so many great stories, and he just loves the craft in a very um true, genuine way, which is always
Oh, absolutely,
great to
absolutely.
see.
Well, I've been blessed with the chance to have worked with him for 25 years almost. So and I was in that period when we were using the Scream. And yeah, I'd even argue I think he used it way more times than Ben did, and helped
Yeah.
propagate it with all of his coworkers at the shop and
Yeah.
his friends there, including myself. Let me stop just for a second. You are all invited to put questions in the Q&A window. It's open up, or in the chat in the webinar windows here. I've got a few from our museum subscribers who are also watching. But please chime in with your questions, and I don't know if we'll get to them all, but we'll try to get as many as we can. So anyway, resuming. In fact, let's go to one of the questions right now that I have
That'd be
from
great.
one of our subscribers, because it's sort of an introductory thing. Uh, Chuck asks, "Who were some of the people you interviewed, and who did you enjoy talking to the most?" And
Oh.
I would say probably Richard for you. Would be
Oh,
one of
well,
them.
I absolutely, talking to Richard has been incredible. But I will say, we've talked to an amazing group of people. Obviously, talked extensively with Steve, which has to be top of the pile because Steve has all the most important information and great stories, and has just been so enthusiastic and warm. So I'm putting Steve top.
Thank you.
Uh, of course. We've gotten a chance to, we talked to Mark Mangini, who most famously worked on Mad Max Fury Road and on Dune, and I mean, among a huge career of sound work. We've talked to obviously Richard Anderson. We talked to David Barbie, who is really fun. He's a TV sound editor. He currently works on What We Do in the Shadows, which is one of my favorite shows. And he was a little bit tricky to find, but the reason I tried to find him was because he was the most prolific TV sound user of the Scream, and so I wanted to track him down. So he was my favorite get, in the sense that I had to really work to find him, and he was amazing. Andrew Cash is a director and an editor who works in the kind of in the Arrowverse shows and some of the sci-fi fantasy, who is one of the people who, he's just a huge fan of the Scream, and he was so fun because he voiced a lot of how I feel about the Scream, which is pure love, even though a lot of people find it grating. But I actually think the conversation that I laughed the most and kind of really enjoyed the most might have been when we spoke with Ron Bartlett, who is a great sound mixer. He also worked on Dune, among a million other films. And he, he's one of your good buddies. And seeing you guys go back and forth about working together was so much fun. But I think the most bizarre and just funniest story to me was he talked about how when you guys worked at Weddington, which for anyone who doesn't know, it was kind of like essentially like a sound, how would you describe it? Like a
post-production house, sound editorial house. There were, it was a time where the studios, a lot of them didn't even have an in-house sound department anymore. So all these boutiques popped up, and we were one of them. There were about 3 that were like pretty much at the top of the game, and we were one of them.
Weddington was a huge one, and there's so many fun hijinks from everyone who worked there, which is why I really realized how central Weddington is to the story. But Ron had the craziest story about how you guys had worked with Steven Soderbergh at the beginning of his career, which I'm a huge Steven Soderbergh fan, and he talked about how Steven Soderbergh, they would talk about music because Ron's a musician and has a band, and they were trying to come up with band names. And I guess Ron said that Steven's band name idea was Man Lurking, which for some reason it made me laugh so hard, to the point that I've been editing the footage and I'm like, how do I get rid of me laughing over all of this? But it was it was so fun. And he was he's very dry, as you know.
We play off each other really well, because I can be very gregarious and loud and funny, and he's
like and he's one of those people, and I've realized it now, meeting people in sound. I've met a lot of people who either got into sound because they really loved films, or they were musicians who understood sound, but they didn't necessarily, they wanted, to find a job to supplement their music. And I think it's fun to talk to those people, because there's a different approach to filmmaking. I'm someone who just watched movies my whole life, and I'm obsessed with movies. So I'm coming to things from a place of loving movies, but I've always been interested by people who don't really necessarily love movies, but kind of end up working in the industry. And I'm always curious about how people land in it, because it's such a specific type of job. But I think it works so well for musicians because they really understand, the storytelling of sound, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Cool.
He was a blast. I thought that was a especially funny and fascinating conversation.
Yeah, we had fun. We had a lot of fun. And Ron is now very successful re-recording mixer, won an Oscar not too long ago for Dune. Great guy. He's currently mixing Dune 2.
Yes. And one of the exciting things about that too was our sound, our production mixer, Jeremy, who was recording on set. It was really fun for me to watch him, because he was meeting all these people that he really looks up to. And I remember saying, we have Ron Bartlett on the, and he's like, Ron Bartlett, it was exciting to see his enthusiasm.
It was fun watching all the little chats that were happening in the corners of the locations we were doing. And it was pretty fun. And I remember I brought a video. I don't want to ruin too much because, you know, everyone's going to see the doc soon, but, well, soon.
Yes.
Um, I remember I brought a video of some clips that Wilhelm was in, and I was rolling it and just sort of absolutely talking. And we had to stop because we had to start working. And so I
Yeah.
shut it down, and I didn't realize. I looked to my left, and both the two of the guys, our crew, were like just hanging on and listening to me. And I didn't notice until I stopped, and they're like, "Oh." And
Yeah.
I was giving this sort of, you know, this oral history as I was just going, just talking, and they were like,
It was amazing. Well, it's something interesting, Steve, that I feel like I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I
Sure.
have this kind of theory about you and the people who worked at Weddington where, so, you guys, and you introduced me to Gary Rydstrom as well, who
Yeah,
we didn't get a chance to interview directly for this, but, hopefully in a further iteration of the film, I'd love
we
to
might. Yeah,
sit down with him. He's an incredibly kind person. He won multiple Academy Awards. He, in my mind, for me, most importantly, sound design, Jurassic Park, and Toy Story, which were two of my favorite movies growing up. But also, I was a huge Aladdin fan and a huge Beauty and the Beast fan, and these movies that Steve and the Weddington guys worked on. And what I've always been curious about is, for me, these are movies that are really shaped me. But in a way, I've always felt like a little bit bittersweet that there's a bittersweet feeling to the fact that you and people who worked on those movies, in some ways, those movies don't exist as things that you went out and saw. You participated in making them. So in a way,
well,
they don't.
I've kind of
Yeah. How do
trained
you feel?
myself. I kind of trained myself because I grew up in the film business. My dad was a writer and a consultant, and I would follow him to movie sets and things like that. Uh, I learned very early on how to sort of distance myself, and I can still enjoy a film. And the trick is when you're working on something, of course, you're seeing it for the first time in an incomplete form. So your imagination has to sort of take over, and you're looking for the story they're telling. And we've been blessed to work on these really wonderful films, so it's fairly easy to see what it's going to be. And in that respect, it's not a problem for me. And one film that we actually bid on, but we did not get. You mentioned Gary. We got to see Toy Story very early on.
Wow.
And it was almost all storyboards except for a couple sequences and a few shots here and there. And one of the sequences that was finished, that was pretty much all laid out, it was still black and white and there was still some roughness, but they had pretty much animated completely the Plastic Army Men sequence. And I was just on the floor laughing.
Wow.
I mean, this is brilliant. It was my first chance to actually see the work that they're doing and how they're
Was
going to
this
tell
the
the story.
scene where they're like, "We leave no man behind"? Like
Yeah,
they try to,
yeah. Go
that is
on
so
without
embedded.
me.
Yes, that is so embedded
Yeah.
in my
And the
brain.
baby
Wow.
monitor and all that. That was
Yeah.
the first sequence they did.
Wow.
And the first time one of those guys to walk, that shuffle that
That's
I was
right.
just on the floor. And inverse of that, one sequence that was entirely storyboards was the Martian sequence in the Pizza
Yes.
Planet.
Yes. The claw
Goodbye, my
machine.
friends. Yeah, I'm going to a better place.
Yeah.
It was told so well
Wow.
that even just in storyboards,
Wow.
I was just taken
Blown
in.
away.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
That's
we,
so
and,
cool.
and we have a question regarding this from Mary. Steve,
Oh,
when you watch a
yes.
film or TV show, what do you listen for to evaluate the sound design? Well, do you mean like if I'm going to be working on something, or if I'm just watching
Or
it as a
maybe,
passive?
I think
I'll answer
maybe,
both ways, but
yeah.
just as a passive viewer, I'm trying to just get sucked into it. Sometimes if a story isn't told very well, I'll start looking for the seams and, oh yeah, they could have done this better, or they could have done that better. But when we're watching a film that we're going to be working on, and usually the director is there and people are there and we can talk about it, we can spot it together and say, oh, well, you need this to tell the story, or I think you're going for this, you'll need this kind of sound, that kind of thing. It's yeah, what am it's not necessarily anything specific I'm looking for. I'm looking for a way to help tell the story. the way that they want, and it's a very collaborative kind of thing. We're serving the director's vision. It's funny because one of the things we're talking about in this documentary is, the Wilhelm and trying to get it in all these films and all that. But, if it doesn't serve the story, if there's not a place for it that works, we're not going to use it, unfortunately. And some people who are just starting this business might not get that and just push it in. So I don't know if that answers your question.
If well, on the reverse end of that, is there, would you say if you're watching something, how often are you struck by, wow, this sound really came together well, or how often are you struck by the opposite of, oh man, I really can hear the mistakes and this whole soundtrack just isn't working? Like, do you have those experiences when you're watching?
Yeah, sometimes. And like I
Yeah.
said, when it's not done well, you start noticing those
Right.
sorts of things. It's really funny because my mom, who passed away about 8 years ago, but she didn't completely understand what I did, but I would explain things to her and tell her and show her examples and all that. So she kind of got it. But it was interesting because when something was bad, she would notice. Like, if there was a bad ADR line, a line that was replaced and it just stuck out, she would like turn to me and say, boy, that was a bad loop, wasn't it? And it was really surprising because it's like someone at work telling me that, but it was my mom who like has no clue what we do.
Interesting.
So it had to be bad enough for my mom to notice.
Right.
But yeah, that's usually when the seams become apparent and I start noticing that sort of thing. But I do think that you can learn just as much, if not more, from a bad movie than a good movie because
I agree with that.
sorts of things. Yeah.
I do too. I've always thought if I ever taught a film class, I would make us watch terrible movies and then talk about why they didn't work.
Yeah. Jillian asks, so were you actively trying to get the Wilhelm Scream into the films or just incidentally found places where it would fit?
Good question.
Yes, is the answer to that.
Both.
Very early on, when I was fortunate to work with these guys, I was purposely trying to, find a place for it and everything. But, there's sometimes where it just does not work. Or one of the creative leaders on the project, the director, producer, whatever, saying, no, we're not using that there. And you got to give in, it's their story. But I did. There was a period where I was a little too aggressive. And to be quite honest, all of you people here watching this, the reason you know about it is probably because of all the times that we used it.
Yeah, truly. I can say from my objective research, this is true.
Yeah. So, I mean, but ultimately, you want to find a place where it works.
Well, can I follow up on that, Steve?
Of
because
course.
I was telling someone about the project this weekend and, they asked me, because I kind of mentioned this concept that we'll elaborate on in the film, but something that Richard Anderson likes to talk about, which is the stealth Wilhelm. And that can sometimes manifest as hiding the Wilhelm scream by either changing the pitch or playing it backwards. But basically, really it's it's there, but it's not really necessarily noticeable. And someone asked me, what would be the purpose of hiding the scream? And so how would you explain that?
There are 6 takes of the Wilhelm scream, as diehards will know, and all of our sound crew knows. The last 3 takes, 4 through 6, are the ones that are very, very recognizable. Those are the ones that people know. That's a Wilhelm. You hear it. That's it. So unless it's like a gratuitous sort of gag reference where it's a Wilhelm, we're doing it, or it's a Star Wars film where, we got to get it in, or Indiana Jones, even though Gary pitched it down a little bit for the last indie film, we'll use it as is in those instances. But there's sometimes where we don't want it to call attention to itself because it's so recognizable. So we'll mix it down. We'll do little things to it. Just we don't want it to call attention to itself necessarily, so that you get out of the story. It's like we've said this several times in the course of the documentary. It'll probably come out in the piece. You know, Hitchcock had a cameo in all these films, but once people started becoming aware of it, he would put it earlier in the film so that you get it out of the way and you'll be watching the movie. You'll be paying attention to the actual
Right.
film and not looking for him to show up. And it's like when you're watching an Indiana Jones film or a Star Wars film, you were waiting for it sometimes because you knew about it.
Right.
And that's not necessarily a good thing. So that's one of the reasons we do it. But the first 3 takes of the session are recognizable to some diehards and all of us, but they're not the obvious Wilhelm. So we will use those sometimes as a stealth Wilhelm. We'll sneak it in. In fact, Richard Anderson directed a film of a couple of years ago, and I cut the sound for it. He graciously allowed me to do it. Why? I have no clue. I am not worthy, but I cut the sound for Richard's film. And I used one of the first 3 just to get it in there, because it's Richard. There's got to be a Wilhelm in it, but I didn't want to use the obvious thing. And it was a drama. I mean, there's some comedy in it, but it was mostly a drama. So it's like, I don't want to turn it into that. So
Yeah. We're getting such good questions here.
Yeah, Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on people who think the Scream is distracting or pulls from the immersion of the film? Do you think they have a point? Or people taking these movies, predominantly action movies, too seriously? It's funny you should say that, because one of the questions on my end from the Sound Museum, Tim, said, did we talk to anyone for the documentary who was really bothered by the Scream and thinks it should be retired? But I personally, I completely agree. That's why we do the whole stealth Wilhelm thing, and that's why we sort of sneak it in under the radar. Not everybody does that, and yes, it can be distracting to people who know it. I'm on the fence about it, because I get it, but I still use it, but I don't make it obvious unless it's a gratuitous gag that demands you hear a Wilhelm.
Yes.
So anyway,
it's well, there's so many. It's been such a primary part of my research is this question, because I think one of the parts of the Wilhelm Scream, one of the things that makes it so fascinating to me is how polarizing it is. I think what's really fun is the people who have been more strongly in the camp of retiring the Wilhelm Scream, and actually a big person in that, on that side of things, is Ben Burtt himself. And he's someone who really, it's hard to get him to even talk about it, because I think he just feels it's so overused and overdone. And I think on that end of the spectrum, I started out this process thinking, I can't really understand people who don't like it. Now I do. I've spoken to now a lot of people in sound who very understandably say, our job is to serve the story and to serve the art, and it's not our job to call attention to ourselves. That makes perfect sense to me. On the other side of the spectrum, what I'm excited about is having Andrew Cash's voice in the documentary, because
he was great. I'm so glad I dragged him in. Yeah.
Yes, I am too. And he's someone who, I really related to Andrew Cash a lot. I relate to Andrew Cash a lot.
Yeah.
He's grew up in the South. I grew up in the South. He grew up as like an extremely obsessed movie kid. I was a pretty extremely obsessed movie kid. He is so funny because he is like, I do not understand anyone who doesn't like the Scream. And he, like you're saying, Jeremy, he kind of feels people are taking things too seriously when they get up in arms about it. And I do think it would be one thing if you were watching, some type of extremely,
if you're watching
dark,
a Kramer versus Kramer,
right?
Like that,
right. There are situations where it's indisputable it wouldn't work, But when you're like you're saying, Jeremy, like an action movie, you do kind of have to call attention to like, we're making an action adventure movie, we're
Yeah.
making a sci-fi movie, we're making a movie,
When you have someone
you know?
like Schwarzenegger that sort of winks at the camera with his lines,
Right.
his signature things, yeah, you can get
It's a
away with it.
movie.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of joy to what I love about the Wilhelm Scream, which is you're kind of, I see it as paying homage in a way to the art form. And I see it as the people who use it, at least the people I've spoken to who use it, they're all people who really love movies. They really love sound. They really love this stuff. And I think that is something, there's value in that too. For me, when I hear it, it makes me feel really joyful. I spoke to some people who they're like, makes me feel really like kind of safe, and it makes me feel kind of, I don't know, like less lonely. And I think there's something really beautiful about that too. So I think both ends of the spectrum make sense, but there are a lot of people, I'm happy to report, that are like very enthusiastically love using the Wilhelm.
Yeah. It was interesting because Mark Mangini, even, esteemed
Yeah.
double Oscar winner Mark Mangini, who I also worked with for almost 30 years, is tiring of it and kind of, not doing. In fact, we had a conversation. I interviewed him for the Editors Guild magazine Wavelength not too long ago, and we actually ended the piece with that discussion. And he did use one in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I think is still in theaters right now.
Yeah.
But he sort of grudgingly did, because he hadn't cut one in many, many years. And at the end of the interview, he's, let me ask you something. When was the last time I used one? He couldn't even remember. It's like
Yeah.
something like 12, 13 years. And I said, sounds about right. But the director asked for it. So, he put it in. That's what you do. The director says, I want this. You say, okay, whether you agree with it or not, usually. So yeah, that's sort of an interesting clash. But when the person in control who's signing the checks and all that says that, you got to use it. But Mark, he's getting a little.
Yeah. Well, and I will say it's definitely some of the I guess like as David Barbie very aptly put it, like he puts himself as like second or third generation Wilhelm users. I think at this point probably third generation Wilhelm users. I think those crew are, it's a little fresher for them, and I think it makes a lot of sense that it's kind of old.
And that's great. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, in fact, that's why I started the Hollywood Sound Museum, is so that the old guard can get these stories out there for people to learn from and to build their own work and create their own palette of sounds based on what they've learned before. There is something about going into it fresh and new and not knowing and just building. But also, if your work is just based on film, it's going to be a little derivative. You have to learn life and have experiences and all that, and build from that. And I think the history of what goes into some of these things and how we created them and our inspiration is useful and important for people. So that's why I started the Hollywood Sound Museum. And I encourage all you guys, all you Kickstarter people, please join us at the museum. You can hear our webinars and all that. And we talk about, Wilhelm gets mentioned quite a bit, but we talk about all aspects of sound in entertainment, not just film.
And Steve knows everybody, and I mean literally everybody. It's true. Everyone, you're like, oh, well, I could text him. He's probably around.
It's like that line in Roger Rabbit that's, how do you know where your office was? So I asked the newsboy, he didn't know. So I said, what's in the bacon? Anyway, I wasn't even trying it. It sounded like it. Let's go to another question here. Eric from the museum asks, did you learn anything, Anna, that you didn't know about the history before? And what surprised you?
That is a great question. I've learned new things at every stage. That's for sure. But wow, I have gotten so fixated once I kind of opened the lid to researching the Wilhelm Scream, which is something I've wanted to do for many, many years. I just kept digging. And I'll say that my first oddly enough, the first person I spoke to for my research was actually the daughter of the actor who we now credit as the screamer, the Wilhelm Screamer. And she, she was just this fascinating, amazing person, and told me a lot of stories about this person who we'll talk about in the documentary. But I think once I met Steve, what was crazy was I reached out to Steve very much. I had actually seen there's a YouTube clip, and I think people who've researched the Scream have probably seen this YouTube clip because it's one of the rare kind of interviews done about the Wilhelm Scream. But it's like Steve sitting in front of a computer and he's playing.
By the way, I recently found a higher res version of that I got.
You did? Okay, great. Because I was like, I need a higher resolution version. Steve sitting in front of a computer talking about the different takes of the Scream, which I had never heard. Now, we'll get to it, but there's
tell you how long ago it was. My hair was black.
It was jet black hair, Steve, at a computer. And that was one of the first clips that I saw. And I kind of, what's so cool about this whole process is I was reading as much as I could find, and I was seeing all these names. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I'm not going to ever talk to any of these people, but wouldn't it be cool if I did? Now I can say I've spoken to thus far everyone on this almost all the people on my list, which is incredible, thanks to Steve. But once I started talking to Steve, I think the part that surprised me the most was I kept waiting for someone to say, oh, they've made this documentary. Like, oh, the story is done. Everyone's told it. Everyone knows it. It's over.
Not those little short pieces, which is fascinating. I mean, people have tried to do like news stories and things like that and gotten horribly
little things here and there.
Horribly wrong.
There's been some misinformation out there, which that was exciting to me too, is to like
CBS News. Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, that's one of the really fascinating things that's come up recently is this kind of dispute over where is the original recording of the Wilhelm Scream. And there are different people believe different things. Steve has a theory, which I'll let him share because I think he's the most kind of equipped to have a theory. But there are a lot of people who've used the Scream, but they haven't necessarily spoken to each other. So what was so interesting was being in the room with, for example, David Barbie, who's a TV editor, and he kind of offhandedly said like, oh, this guy I used to work with like gave me a recording of the Scream. And then Steve's like, oh, I know that guy. I gave him the recording. I gave him the beat. Like he got it because of me. And so what's been really awesome is like there's all these little kind of nodes of people who've used it or love it. And I keep connecting them and finding ways that they all link back. And it's been really fun because the Scream is this connector. And I think what I've been most surprised by is just like everything that I dreamed of, which is that I was like, I'm hoping that I discover that this is just the most fun inside joke of all time. And I had always had in my brain, I'm like, there must be these sound editors that are like kind of nudging each other and being like, did you hear it? And I was
that's how we did it originally. And that's what it was.
That's what I found.
You were waving to each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was what was so cool for me was I was like, this is what I had imagined. And once I learned about Weddington, and Weddington was run by Mark Mangini, Richard Anderson, and Steve Flick. And that's where Steve was a sound librarian. And that's where so many of these films were made. Once I learned about, all these people were in the same office and they were like, chatting with each other and having all these funny inside jokes and all these gags. And I was like, oh, it really is this image I had in my head of people having fun. Yeah. And that is when I felt so excited to tell the story, because I was like, this is exactly as cool and fun and exciting as I hoped it would be.
Well, it was funny because at our interview with Richard, you interviewed him singularly, and then I sat with him and we chatted for a long time. And we had like 5 minutes at the end, and I was trying to think, what haven't we talked about? And I jumped to what you were just describing. To reiterate the whole thing about just being so much fun to be at that place with so many like-minded people and really insanely creative sound people that are doing all this great work. and just the madness that ensued from that. And I say this in the piece, and it's so true. When you can have an environment like this, your productivity just soars and your imagination just soars. And that's when, as long as the work gets done, they don't care what you do or when you're there or whatever. As long as you show up on the dub stage and the work is there and it's good, nothing else matters. Some people
Yeah.
would come in and work from like midnight to like 8 a.m. and then leave. Or some people would come in at lunchtime. Richard would do this all the time. He'd come in like just before lunch and then work through the night and then go home, get a few hours sleep, and come back at lunchtime again. It would drive me nuts because when I'm wrapping up my day, because I kept normal hours, normal office hours, Richard would just be getting up to speed and he'd say, "Hey, can you help me with this and this and this?" And Richard, it's 5 o'clock. I gotta go. But we all had our own schedules and our own quirks and silly things and toys in our room, and
Yeah.
But we worked really, really hard. As Richard says, you kind of had to have some kind of release so that you don't go nuts.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of place it was.
And you feel it in the work, and that's what's so cool is like that energy and that fun came through in the films that you worked on, which explains so much about why they're just some of my favorite films, some of the world's favorite films, is because there was so much love and excitement.
It was pretty wild when I look back at it. I several years ago, I was talking to Stephen, and we were sort of reminiscing about our work. Steve Flick, who he and I actually appear in the RoboCop documentary, which just hit Screenbox. Episode 1 is streaming on Screenbox right now. By the time we put this online, this chat, it'll probably be 2 or 3 more episodes. But Stephen and I were talking, and he just sort of absently said, we were kings of the world. And we really were. Some of the films that came out, I mean, RoboCop, the Star Trek films, all the Disney animated stuff, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, Gremlins, Total Recall. They were all these huge
movies, huge movies. I mean, Lion King alone, I mean, all those Disney films are some of the biggest ones, but Lion King, I think that really was such a monumental piece when it came out, because it had Elton John has done this movie. Like, it was just this huge I mean, now the Broadway show's been on for decades. Like, it's just incredible.
Well, that one was especially important to me because that was the first one that my name was actually on, because I'd worked on like 2 or 3 Disney films before that, and my name always got dropped because I was just the sound librarian. Lion King, and I worked really hard on Lion King too, because we had all those animals that I had to track down with Mark Mangini, who did the opening sequence. But yeah, my name actually got on the credits, and I remember at the receiving line of the cast and crew party, Don Hahn, the producer, sort of pulled me aside and said, "I'm so glad we got your name on this one. You've been working so hard." Thank you.
That's beautiful. Well, also, I will expose you a bit and say that Steve, I mean, from all accounts, from all your friends, have been a Disney fanatic through. So even more special to be involved in such important Disney films.
No, it was very important to my my being in this craft, just listening to all those films and being a fan of Jimmy McDonald and all that sort of thing. Which I just did. I just did a podcast not too long ago, which you can find online with my friend Alyssa. It's called A Walk with Walt, and it's a Disney podcast about Walt Disney and all the work. And I talk about that very thing in that Wonderful World of Disney Sunday nights. I would listen and record it with a cassette and listen to all those things. And it was very inspiring to me when I was deciding what I wanted to do with my life. So it's nice to have the chance to actually work on the films. Anyway,
that's amazing.
So what else should we talk about? Hey, keep the questions coming, everybody. We got a whole forum here.
Well, I have did I cut you off?
No. I was just going to say, maybe you should talk about the status of it and where we're at and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. So we are I can officially say, in the post-production phase of the process, which is both exciting and a little bit intimidating because um, in documentary work,
Oh, by
that's
the way,
where
did you see?
the big gulp, Steve's big gulp.
I got
I
teased a
love
lot on
Steve's big
set
gulp.
for the documentary because I always had
I
them.
love it. I love it's emblematic and I love it. It's, I would say in documentary, and I know some documentaries are kind of are very heavily pre-produced, so it's not always
Yeah.
the case, but in most cases with documentary, if you're really kind of going out and investigating, you just shoot everything and you just hope to get as much as you can get, and then you figure it out later. And so I'm in the figure it out later part where this is where the kind of the writing and the storytelling really kicks in. And it's the part that I've been very excited for, but it's also the part that I feels like a kind of it's a big responsibility in my mind. I think I have a myriad of ways that I could kind of lay out this information.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to do it in the way that feels true, if that makes sense. I think my way of editing, as someone who is kind of an obsessive documentary consumer, but also like a lifelong editor, is it's very instinctual, and I basically try to replicate. If I were to double click on the Wilhelm Scream, what is the first thing I'd hope to read, and what's the second thing, and what's the third thing, and what's the fourth thing? So I'm trying to let that kind of flow. And so I'm currently at the stage where I want to hold myself to kind of getting this into a good rough stage within the next couple of months. I do sadly have a full-time job, which gets in the way of doing fun stuff. But I think getting it to a place that I feel good about, that's the goal in the next couple of months. And then from there, I'm excited because I'm going to do a little bit more shooting. I have some vintage equipment. I have a reel-to-reel and also a really cool tape recorder, which I recently bought. I'll have to show you, Steve, live, because I'll see if this looks at all period accurate. It might not. It might be a little bit later than what you would have used as a youth.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. Yeah, I talked about my
exciting.
recording sounds and listening to things.
Yes.
The equipment I used as a kid. That's very much like it.
It's kind of like
Yeah,
it's
not.
it's meant to be portable.
Yeah, it's not exactly. It's funny because a lot of them have that sort of faux leather case around them. Mine would wear out, so I would usually take that off very quickly.
I could
see what
see
it looks
that
like beyond
underneath.
But yeah, I had one. That one would have been. I would have loved to have had that one because it's got the RCA inputs. Most of the ones I had did not. They usually had the phono plugs.
This one's kind of, so this is an old Sony.
Yeah, that looks very much like the kind of ones that I
the
used.
Kind of ones.
Yeah,
and
it's not the
even
exact
has
one.
a little, this one came with, and I don't know if you would have used this, but it comes with its little.
They usually did. Some of them had little condenser mics built into the actual thing.
That makes sense.
So you would just put it, but then you'd hear the motor of the thing. That's most of the background tapes of my TV shows have just this little tiny quiet motor going in the background.
Yes. So I'm excited to
it's great.
keep working with Max, our DP, to get some beauty shots of that stuff. And then I think we have some great archival. One of the tricks of this project, and I'm sure anyone who's worked in film or TV will know that this is a tricky part, is the fair use element of the work, where we want to use clips from movies, clips from TV shows, different things, but we want to use it in a way that is legal. What's exciting is that early on in the process, I connected with Midge Costin, who Steve knows well. She's an amazing person. She teaches sound at USC, but she is a documentarian. She made an amazing documentary, Making Waves, that's about sound. It
Required
interviews
viewing for anyone who is serious about sound.
100%. You can
Yeah.
find Making Waves. I watched it on
It,
Amazon, but it's around
it's on
different
YouTube
places.
with commercials.
Yes,
It's out
that's
there.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is absolutely required viewing. It's
Mm.
really for anyone who, whether you know sound well or if you're totally naive to it, it really lays everything out beautifully. And so I talked to her because I knew she would be the person to advise me on this issue of fair use in this project, because she used footage in a way that I would use footage, which is to illustrate specific elements of sound. And so we had a long conversation and talked about ways to use footage. Some of it is, keeping the duration of the clip pretty short. Some of it is anything that's known as like transforming the footage. So, you know, adding voiceover underneath the footage, or having it kind of placed on the screen in a specific way, or, crediting, or things that you can do to essentially, you know, make it fair use. The laws have changed a lot. So when Midge started her project, and her film took almost 10 years to make. Part of that was because fair use wasn't really an open thing for most of the time she was working on the film, and she got to a point where she said, I can't financially make this film because I can't afford to use all these films. And once that changed, she could actually finish her documentary. So I'm grateful to be working on this at this time, because I have the ability to use that stuff. So I'm going to be doing a lot of work of finding ways to transform the footage, running it by probably getting some legal consultation just to like make sure that's all in a good spot. Any holes we have left over in the story, like, Steve will be able to fill that stuff in, which I'm excited for, because the thing about all this is like, Steve and I have talked about this for hours and hours and hours, but the question is, did I get that piece on tape, or did we talk about that? So there might be a couple
both
of those.
second guessing that when we
Yeah.
had the chance to
And I
shoot some
had
of
a
the pickups.
sheet, but I was like, because one of the things I learned in this process, and some people here have were our Kickstarter backers, which I just like, I get emotional when I talk about the Kickstarter backers, because it was so hugely affirming to double our goal.
Seeing the response so quickly, it was, just me as a passive
incredible
observer watching the numbers go up. It was like, Anna and I were texting back and forth. Wow, you
like
just
how
gained another $2,000,
I couldn't believe it. And it really, any inkling that I had of like, maybe this is a private curiosity I have, just went away, because people were just so excited about it and so supportive. And so that has really done so much for the project, and that amount of money really went such a long way for us to make it really great. But I did learn for myself that in the future, I really, it's having us, a few more people on the team to just kind of figure out logistics is something I really would like to have in the future, because there was a lot of work that was, wanting to organize everybody, organize the crew, organize people we were interviewing, stay in the space of interviewing, but also kind of like, what are we going to get for lunch? Where do we have to go next? And so there was a lot of, by the end of that week, I was just like completely exhausted, and the good kind of exhaustion, but it did teach me that there were things that I was like, okay, I've always gone into filmmaking being like, I'll do everything by myself. I don't need any help. And I think this is a good example of like, it's good to have a little bit of help. And Ian was hugely helpful. Ian,
you had some great guys. Yeah.
Yes, I had a great group of people. Nobody was a straggler. Nobody was like, everybody went above and beyond.
Well, I crashed on your couch once, but
that's right. But that was, there. But overall, it was and my low point was when I didn't foresee LA driving the way I thought that I would. And I have a lot of family in LA, but I personally have not spent enough time in LA to remember that I wanted us all to grab food at one point.
Yeah.
We got to the restaurant and I said, everybody get back in the car. We have to go to the interview. We don't have time to get food.
Yeah.
Those were my kind of moments. But all to say, in terms of where we're at now, I think we are hoping to, my goal is that in the next 2-3 months, we are closer to our kind of post-production phase. We're going to be working on music. Ian is going to be composing some original music.
That's
We're
great.
going to be working on some, sounds, some like getting really into the nitty-gritty of it. But I want to get our story structure and our kind of everything we need in one place.
Yeah.
In the next couple of months. And then to update Kickstarter end of things, we have our stickers here. We have all of our stickers ready. We are working on our kind of production zine that we are going to send out to some backers. We also, I'm putting together so many fun like additional scenes. There's so many. That was one of the Kickstarter rewards, and I was like, I don't know, maybe there won't be any.
I'm worried about some
Oh
of
my
them.
God, they're all, to be honest, most of them are. I will have to say, I'm going to do a compilation of everybody who works in sound doing their automatopoeia sound.
Right.
So everybody we've interviewed had a moment of being like, or like
Yeah.
kapow! Like everybody could do their sound.
Well, the Zoom, when we had you on Zoom while we were interviewing Richard, because you
Yeah.
had to do that virtually, and I gave you the file, and there's some gems in there that you maybe just audio only, where Richard and I are cutting it up, off
It's so
camera.
funny. It's like you guys have this internal language that is so fun. And so we have a bunch of clips of that stuff, which I'm very excited for people who are getting the additional scenes. There's going to be some great stuff in there. And so the Kickstarter end of things, I'm hoping the next couple months, the fall, we'll get people their rewards. And
Well, we'll likely have another
yeah.
one of these too, because that was one of the
Yeah,
promises. And
that's right.
I was planning on doing this for my museum people, and I reached out to Anna and said, we should let those
Yeah.
so yeah, so that's great, because we're very thankful for all of your
Yeah.
contributions, and it's really made us
Couldn't do it without it.
yeah,
Couldn't do the
absolutely.
piece without it.
Well, it's been really, really good. And also I would extend to all the Kickstarter people, please do indeed check out the museum stuff.
Yeah.
It's patreon.com/Hollywood Sound Museum. We have subscriber-based stuff. But if you want to just reach out to me too, if you have any sound questions or anything like that. I just said in that podcast, the Disney one that I did, part of my life at this point is just sharing the craft through the museum and other mediums like this documentary and all that. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to anyone who is genuinely interested in the craft and wants more information.
Yeah, I encourage people to take Steve up on that too. Also, if
Yeah.
you know anyone who is working in the industry or interested in working in the industry, because it is rare to have, there's a lot of really genuinely kind people in the sound end of things, but it's hard to meet people in the industry who really want to share information. I think that as someone who kind of always wanted to work in film, I think that was a big barrier to entry was, well, what if I can't talk to anyone about how this works or what job I could have? And so, I really encourage people to reach out to Steve, because he is the kindest. He, right out the gate, I kept thinking, when is Steve going to be like, show me your credentials? Who is this woman?
It's interesting because there's a question in the box there from Jillian, which I think you should read and you should address.
Oh,
it talks about this
okay.
very thing. Do you see it?
Okay. Yes, I see it. So you said you and Steve have a great rapport. Anna, what was the
Whatever.
point? Absolutely disagree. No.
And you are.
Yeah. What was the point you convinced him or got him on board, or was it organic with the museum connection? So yeah, I would say Steve and I have known each other almost a year.
It was November.
We started, yeah. Okay, so it was November. So it'll be in a few months. And so what was so cool was I found Steve's email on the Hollywood Town Museum website. I went and emailed it cold, which was what I did for most of this project, is just kind of going for it and reaching out to people. Really not sure if I would get a response. And what was so cool was Steve was immediately like, let's talk, let's get on the phone.
Well, I wanted to suss you out.
Yeah.
I
Right.
get emails, quite honestly, daily from people who want to, know about this stuff. And I'm open to talking to anyone, but you had a very specific request. And it was something that I was kind of at the point where, like Mark Mangini, where I was getting a little curmudgeonly about it. But I wanted to learn about you and your approach and all that, and you had all the right answers. So
Yeah, what do you think was the thing that made you think, oh, okay, this person kind of knows what they
well,
want to do?
just the way you were handling it, and the story you wanted to tell, the history of it, including sound history in general.
Yeah.
Because that's what I was really strong about. And I was still suspicious for a little while, but over the course of our conversations and all that, you sort of won me in. I mean, when I heard that you wanted to call it the Wilhelm Scream, I was like, well, that kind of hits it on the head, doesn't it? And I was a little upset about that, and I'm sure you sensed that. But we had a little talk, and I kind of I think I ended one of the conversations with, okay, fine. And
He
then
did.
yeah.
And that was one of the things I stuck with, because I kind of, the whole time I've been coming to this project has been, the idea is I'm an outsider, and I'm kind of representative of the people outside of the industry who love love the Wilhelm Scream. And so I was like, we want this project to be all about a lot more than this, whatever it is, 4 seconds of audio.
It's called the Wilhelm Scream because that's the majority of it, and
that's what
frankly,
gets people in the door.
that will bring people in. Yeah, I mean, all of
Yeah.
you people who contributed to it, you saw
Just saying
about.
it gets people
Yeah.
light up. But also, I think what I love about that name, what I've always loved about the name, the Wilhelm Scream, is it's kind of an evocative concept. And what I think, when I'm thinking of the Wilhelm Scream, I'm thinking of the idea of like an earworm, a thing that sticks with you. And what I want to do in this piece is, as you said, and the hope, just so everyone knows, is the aim is this will be a short documentary, but the aim is to develop this into a feature, because I feel so strongly about this being a feature film.
Yeah.
But the Wilhelm Scream is really representative of these pieces, these artifacts that kind of follow us around, and a lot of them are sound, because a lot of the kind of reuse or sound effects, there's kind of this subconsciousness to them. And that's what I loved about learning more about, as Steve mentioned, Jimmy McDonald from Disney, and then Treg Brown from Warner Brothers,
Yeah.
was there's a huge history to the world of just sound effects, this art form that is really deeply layered, I think, in our brains, especially people who grew up watching movies. There's these little things, and they're just kind of in there in the back of your head, and you hear them, and it just gets you, and it's just something, and it just works. And I think, as someone who's always been a very visual person, it's been really fun to explore this whole other side of experiences, and it's made me watch movies and TV completely differently. And now I've been very obnoxious as a viewer, because I'll be sitting with Ian or my friends, and I'll be like, that's this, that's the door thing, and
dial it down.
Yeah, it's so it's like, now it's really getting in my head, and I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, wouldn't it be so cool if everybody watched stuff with this? I feel like people who watch this film are going to, from there on out, watch films differently, because they'll kind of be listening for that stuff. And that's something I think is exciting and great.
Well, it's interesting, because the museum, one of the aspects to the museum too, is up to a certain point, all of the studios had their own collections, and you could identify the studios by their sounds. Now it's like all this stuff is out, especially with the cartoon sound effects. You listen to a contemporary cartoon on, one of the channels, one of the various cartoon channels.
Hmm.
And it's a amalgamation of all these different sounds. The history is kind of gone. And it's kind of sad.
Yeah.
But we're trying to share some of this history so that these people who are making these new sounds and this new birth of, cartoon sound people, regular movie sound people, can learn from it and
Yeah.
build their
And
own.
honor the art
Yeah,
form. It's an art
absolutely.
form.
Yeah. Well, then, we've been talking for an hour or so. We
Yeah.
should probably shut up now.
You've heard enough from us.
That's right.
This
But
was so
we will
this
do
was
this
so
again.
awesome. I'm so appreciative of everybody's questions because they're really, really good questions.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And we will have another one of these in the near future and keep
Yeah.
everybody updated.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. And like I said, check out the museum. You're welcome to bother me on the internet.
You're also welcome to DM me as well. If you ever have a thought or a question about the film project, feel free to the Wilhelm Scream doc on Instagram or on Facebook. You can always send me a message as well. Check in.
Yeah, we both have an active presence on Instagram and all those sites. So please reach out if you would like. Good to see you,
Awesome.
dear.
Good to see you too, Steve.
Yeah. Everybody out there, keep listening. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.